What's up guys, this is Kakor and TCG back with another video, and today I will be going over my favorite video of the month, the what did well in X set, aka the meta snapshot. This month we'll be talking about set 11 for Vanguard Zero Global. And before I get started, just a special thanks to the QK tournament Discord and Wolf the Legend for supplying tournament data to make a more calculated tier list and meta analysis possible. Before we get started, let's go over a couple of things. First, if an event is under 24 players, we only track top 4 because otherwise we get saturated stats and we don't want that. Otherwise, we'll take top 8. So far, we have 3.5 weeks, so just for this month of event data, and that sums up to 367 deck submissions, 3 individual events that happened. First, let's talk about the QK dailies and the weeklies. So here are the top 5 most popular decks for the QK dailies and the normal $10 cash prize weeklies. We have Good Stuff Aquas in first at 14% representation. Then we have Erads at 13%, and we actually have like a little tie here between Spikes and Dote at 11% representation. And then Jewel Knights at an 8% representation overall, so this makes up about 50% of the decks that were shown. So if you played in any of the QK events for most of this month, half the decks were any of these 3, like most of your matchups was this. Next, let's go over top cut breakdown, which is a little bit different than deck representation breakdown. What actually made it to top 4? So over the month so far, we have Good Stuff Aquas, Triple D Dote, Spikes, Erads, and Jewel Knights being the top 5 well-performing decks that just continue to show up in top 4, and the QK tournament Discord for the dailies and the casual and the dailies and the weeklies. Good Stuff Aquas capping out at 15%, and the popularity of Spikes and Triple D Dote is quite high there, to the point where they actually was able to push Erads down to being the 4th best performing deck as far as making top cut goes. Really impressive, and it also shows that player representation does play a role in deck representation itself. And this is also why we see this Battle Sisters at 6%. Battle Sisters does really well against decks like Triple D Dote, Erads, well not Erads, but like Triple D Dote and anything that multi-attacks, and also can like ruin Aquaforce with the Diamantes and the Basil. This means that it's a good pick into a lot of these more top tier matchups, but sometimes it can feel under subpar. So it's definitely in the control lane, similar to like a Shadow Paladins or a Sook, but it is an alternative option. So shout out to those players that made this deck known. Next, we're going to go over the Coco Cup Weekly, my event. As a general rule, I only track clan names instead of the decks themselves, like the actual deck list, because it's easier for me and it kind of shows deck popularity more than like specific lists doing well or clan popularity. So if we see here Narukami being the most popular clan at 19% representation, 20 decks, Aquaforce, and then Kagero, Jewel Knights, and then BT and Spikes also tying up. So we're seeing these trends of Spikes usually tying with someone, and they're starting to fall off a little bit. But what we do notice here is that Narukami does very well. This is actually the first month since Narukami has been released that it actually takes the #1 spot for deck representation for the Coco Cup Weekly. In the past, it's been trumped by things like Gold Paladins and Spike Brothers, so we're kind of seeing it finally rise to the occasion. There's enough people who feel comfortable and have the cards now, where we're seeing it truly be the dominant tier 1 beast that it actually is. And here is the top cut breakdown for the Coco Cup Weekly with Erads. Most of those decks are Erads. I think 2 or 3 are other Narukami variants, but basically 19% Erads. Dote tying for first and top cut breakdown, so things in top 4 over the month. Dote doing very well right now. Aquas, most people play Good Stuff Aquas. I think I've seen 2 Transcore Glory lists, and then like BT, Spikes, OTT, mostly Tsukiyomi, and Jewel Knights. Next, let's talk about Wolf the Legends event. So Wolf the Legends event is a little bit bigger, so we keep track of top 8, but before we get into that, just general representation. What are we seeing? we're seeing about 1 in every 5 decks being submitted is Eradicators, followed by very similar stats between Good Stuff Aquas, Triple D Dote, Jewel Knights, and Spikes. There's a lot of other stuff being played, and there is a very nice variety. But I think when people think of like, is the game unhealthy or not, when you're seeing that Erads barely are taking up 20% of a tournament, that's quite good, right? That means that, you know, only 1 out of every 5 decks is Erads. The other 4 can be anything else. And so we don't have like a 1 deck dominant format, which is, you know, always nice to see. And here is the top cut breakdown for Wolf the Legends events. This is, of course, keeping track of top 8, not top 4. We have Erads at the top, Good Stuff Aquas, Spikes, Jewel Knights, and then Dote. So we're seeing the same people show up: Erads, Aquas, Spikes, Jewel Knights, and Dote. And that's just been a trend we've been seeing, as those are really the 5 best performing decks. You can play other stuff, but these decks just seem to be winning the most. They have the most people playing them. So even if their win rate isn't as high as you think it would be, it's just there's so many people playing it, it's got to get in somehow. So after going through the stats, let's talk about what technically is the best 3 decks of this set 11 meta. We have Erads and Aquaforce in like a hard first place and second place. And then I opted for Triple D Dote in the spot because it seemed to, between deck representation and just general stats, it seemed to do the best out of the other 3 options. These decks are just very good, and a lot of people say I don't think Triple D Dote is that high, Coco, because it's piece reliant. I understand where you're coming from, but every deck in Vanguard is piece reliant. It's just the meta we've come to where each deck needs a certain amount of cards to combo off of. It's part of it being a TCG. So to say that Dote needs X amount of cards in hand to make it work is a hindrance doesn't really work, because then that means that a lot of these other decks that are doing just as well, if not better, are also at a hindrance as well. And so that's part of my rationale for putting Dote so high on my tier list recently. Here is the tier list. As typical with the Kokorin TCG tier list, we have the 5 Bs of the meta: broken, barely, balanced, bad, meme. It's not a very good indication of where things are, and I'll kind of explain that, but I think it's funny, and that's where we're going with it. So I guess I'll kind of jump around to like important parts of the tier list, and of course, if I don't touch on anything in the video, please, if you have questions, let me know. There's a Kokorin TCG Discord. You can ask me there. You can also ask me in the comment section below, and we can get a really good discussion started. But like everything in bad, and I think like to an extension, some of the stuff at the bottom of balanced, they're not bad. Like I think they're playable, and if you know what you're doing, you can easily clap. You can easily steal wins from any of these decks at the top here. It's just you really have to know what you're doing, and you have to be in an optimal scenario. Usually, things that are average in like strength, so like average decks like tier 3s, tier 4s, typically you need to have at least 2 of your, whatever your deck's 3 goals are, you need to have 2 of those hit in order for you to pop off and, you know, take your win, while stuff up here may not need to hit all 3, and they may only have 2 things that need to go off, right? And so it's just a factor. There's nothing wrong with playing any of these decks. You just really have to know what you're doing. We've seen success from these decks before. We've also seen a lot of people fail trying, so you just, you know, more power to you if you play them. If you're interested, just know you gotta know your stuff. Following pretty much after like Pentagonal Magus, I have like Reiji. I think these are kind of in the same spot. We have Libs all the way up to, I guess I'd say like Tachis, right? I'd probably put Battle Sisters. Now that I think about it, Battle Sisters probably go ahead of Tachis here. Those decks are also kind of in a similar boat. They're okay, they do well. They typically will have like 1 to 2 really good matchups against something up here, but there will also be something else up here that's of equal threat to them. And that's probably why your deck is in balance. It's like, it may do well against 1, but it may lose to 3, right? It's just how the cookie crumbles. Some stuff to highlight: Ripples is pretty good, has a nice explosive mid game, and the right chain's fairly consistent. Gyros is still not Rukami, so something to look out for. I dropped Coral just because we've been seeing a rise in Prism play, which means there's less Coral around, so just because it's still equally doing as well, it's just more people are playing Prism now, so drop Coral down a bit. Vanguard, kind of in the same boat as Gyros, but it's a little high rolly, so it happens. And Libs, they're not bad, they're not good. As they get more support though, they will really start to grow into this really scary deck, and so they'll just only keep going up. So if you invested in Libs, just because it's in balance now doesn't mean it's going to stay in balance forever. And then Tachis, they're okay, but they really need to push. They need to push in order to stabilize and get stuff going. But the Ancient Dragon engine kind of, their new Vanguard kind of functions as like a bootleg descendant, if you will, with the crit and everything. And it's quality. Like, it's not bad, it's not awful, but it's not like the most broken thing ever. Following that, we have up to like Shadow Duke up to Pale Moon, right? And I think that these decks are here because they do well against like specific matchups, right? They have like those 1 to 2 really good ones, but they also have some like really glaring weaknesses against decks that are way too popular for their own good. A good example of this is Pale Moon is a very strong multi-attack deck that can really just, even without Dreamy Fortress, can actually put in a lot of work. You can build columns if you're using Crimson Beast Tamer, and even if you're not, you hit triggers pretty often since you're selective soul charging non-triggers. The issue is that like Eraz, Aquaforce, and Kagero when they're on DO, so it just kind of shuts off their defensive play, and it only leaves you with half your game plan, which you can still win with half your game plan. You just have to be an amazing pilot, and we have seen a couple of players pilot the deck really just in an insane way and make it work, but it's not easy. Stuff like Shadows and Vermilion, they're just good. They have some good board control, and they have some pretty decent tempo against stuff up here, especially Vermilion being able to clear intercepts against some of these decks that really like putting up intercepts. Shadows is really good against Erad, so it's only been moving up on my tier list as time has been going on since I started doing this. And especially once we get Revengers, they have a nice cozy spot up here, so that's a thing. And then of course Murakumo, it's bricks because Ride Chain, but it has a good matchup against a lot of these break ride reliant decks because it has that cool Ride Chain. Once you hit grade 2, you're swinging, you can push on the 4. It feels really nice playing this deck, but it can break a little. So as long as you don't break on Mura, then you're fine. That's the balanced tier. So next we're going to talk about the barely tier. Basically at the bottom of barely we have, or like the tier 1.5. I think it's fair to say like this is tier 1, tier 1.5, tier 2, and tier 3. I don't think the split is that big. I think pretty much almost everything's viable. We got MLB, Fortuna, Zeracule, Dungry Unlimited, and Seal. I think that those kind of all function in the relative same spot. Things like Dungry and MLB were once, kings of the meta, but they've kind of started to taper off and, been replaced for more power creeped options now, but they're still very good. And then Fortuna and Zera are just really like good stuff. Genesis with Fortuna, and then good stuff Zera, Celestials. Just really they do need a good pilot for these decks, but if you know what you're doing, it's really hard to beat a player playing these decks when they know what they're doing. It's basically the best way to put it. And they have really good game plans that still translate well to even the power creeped aggressive multi-attacking meta as we get these more aggressive like crit and multi-attack cards. So just very consistent, very good, but not the best. Seals, they're cool. They beat up Sook, and they can also like mess with Jewel Knights, even though Jewel Knights can get their stuff back, but they can mess with some of the superior calling decks and force them to use their resources in a way they don't want to, which is quite nice. So it's kind of like a passive aggressive, like pseudo Shadow Paladins. Like if I had to pick though, I'd probably play Shadows over Seals, but it's a preference. And then like we have Sook, Ethics Plow, Golds, and Glory Maelstrom. Logic here is, I remember I did put Zook pretty high on my last tier list, but we had to move that down with the inclusion of Kagero. A lot of the Kagero pieces actually give Zook a little bit of trouble in my opinion, especially with the Seals and Corduroy and some of the other like 1-ofs and 2-ofs just being really good tags to deal with your opponent stacking cards. Ethics Plow has really fallen off in play, but I still think it's just as good. It's just we have Triple D Dote as that new multi-attack hype. So Now that there's a new multi-attack hype deck to play, decks like Spikes and Ethics Plow are going to see a decrease in play just because the multi-attack fans want to try something else. Gold's still very good. There's Loyalist. It's really starting to fall off and starting to reflect more Tsukiyomi numbers, specifically the Azel build, but it's still very good. And then at the top of my tier 1.5, the barely tier, is Gloria Maelstrom. I think it's nice. It does well against those combo decks like Triple D Dote, Spike Brothers, and if your opponent's E-Red list is very reliant on Draconic Descendant and they're not drawing very well, Transcore can also bully them too. Just, it really is a mind game, and you're really pressuring your opponent more on the mental side because they know they may only have 3 to 5 cards in hand, and they still need to save 3 cards for the Transfer Glory, and at least 2 of those cards need to be PG in the grade 3. This can really turn off those break ride decks that don't draw very well, because next thing you know, you want to break ride, you want to push for lethal, but you're worried the Aquaforce player has PGs and they're on Transcore ready to ride the Glory. It's a scary position to be in, and so the deck can force people to play in ways they don't want to play. That's why it's there, but it's not as consistent as Good Stuff Aqua's. Still a very good deck. And finally, we have the dynamic 5 of the meta for the set 11 tier list. Sorry about that. We got, this is the top 5 are actually in order here. So we got Erads, Aquaforce, Good Stuff Aquaforce, Triple D Dote in 3rd, like we discussed in the prior slide. And then we have Spikes and Jewel Knights coming in 4th and 5th. I think Spikes are very good, but we're only going to see it decline. There's just new decks. People are going to play new stuff. Jewel Knights, waifu golds with royal deck mechanics. People are going to play it. More people have the cards now. It's popular. It can rush, so it's good against some of these break ride decks and some of the more defensive decks, because those decks want to stabilize on the break ride or stabilize into their grade 3 or whatever their game plan is. And rushing, and when Jewel Knights rush them, it makes it very hard. They have a lot of ways to push for lethal with Julia on top of Ashley. It's just a very flexible list. But its representation isn't too high, but it's still very high. And it's probably does the worst out of these 5 in tournaments. As far as for how many people are playing it, it's not getting the most results. And like I said, Spikes are falling off. And I've already talked about Triple D Dote and Good Stuff Aquas and Erads. Anyways, guys, I think I've rambled enough. This is the meta snapshot for set 11. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think my tier list is accurate? Do you think I put something in the wrong spot? Let me know your ideas, and let's get a really good discussion going. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And this is Kokorin TCG, signing off.